Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, is poised to unleash a major shake-up of his top team to revive what they call Labour's plunging popularity and fight back against reform, and that would include reshuffling his Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, bringing in Yvette Cooper to the Treasury to boost our fortunes. Now, I've spoken to 4 people about this, who I would say are all pretty well sourced, and they've all got back to me and said it's absolute rubbish. I would say, just to sort of take you behind the curtains, generally, if there is a grain of truth or if there is an uncertainty, then people just don't respond to your messages. You know, people leave you unread or they don't get back to you. The fact that they came back and they slammed it dead means I think that they are confident that they, for what they know, they are saying it's absolute rubbish and she's not going to be replaced. But it is interesting that they got back so quickly, and this is coming on the day when presumably there is going to be a certain degree of discomfort amongst many in government who are reading, as you say, not just that the Bank of England's feeling shaky about this, but they're actually tracing it back to the things that she has done herself in the last 4 months.
I think it's perfectly possible, from the history of previous reshuffles and kind of people being fired from jobs, that the story from the Express can be totally wrong but still have a grain of truth in it, i.e. there are people who are starting to think that maybe the problem is Rachel Reeves as the head of the Treasury, and therefore maybe we should be looking, and that we're never going to be able to turn it round while Rachel is the front figure for this. I think it would be surprising, because I think that, you know, it would seem to me that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves are so tied in together with the decision making that has been made that you
all
suddenly...
chancellors and prime minister. Name me one prime minister that's been able to sack their chancellor without falling at the same time.
John Major getting rid of Norman Lamont.
A long time ago.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean,
and Margaret Thatcher famously got rid of Lawson.
Well, Johnson got rid of Sajid Javid.
Yeah. So I don't...
It seems ages ago now. That seems like a long time ago.
Yeah,
but with a very
enough.
particular sense. But I think that... But the thing that I don't buy about this idea about Reeves going, it's partly because, as you say, John, they're politically close. Although actually I'm surprised at the number of people who've told me that they are surprised at the extent to which, and this is maybe another reason...
He's backing her.
He's backing her, but also he basically leaves it to her. I mean, I've spoken to Labour people who say that they've not seen, and civil servants who say they've rarely seen a Prime Minister and number 10 so willing to concede economic policy in the round to number 11 and to the Chancellor. So in one sense there's distance between them, but in another sense it's like, well, you've chosen to do that, so you're also culpable. But I think you've got to think, like, what would be the point of changing her, right? The only point I can see of changing her that would be worth the political instability that Starmer would get from doing that would be if there were a clear alternative economic prospectus from within the cabinet or outside the cabinet, within the Labour Party, someone who had some other economic ideas. Frankly, that does not exist. There have been times in our history when chancellors have been moved out because the Prime Minister has preferred the economic vision of the replacement. There isn't one. There is none.
It would allow you to change your mind.
Vision.
I suppose that's the only thing. It would allow you
But to what?
to row back on NICs, for example, to row back on the farming stuff. I mean, I'm not saying that sets a great precedent for the Prime Minister, but I was at a do on Tuesday night, and it was the Mooch, Anthony Scaramucci, who was basically speaking to a room full of people who I would say, you know, come from sort of city backgrounds, come from investment backgrounds, come from tech backgrounds, you know, his sort of world of salt, if you like. And overwhelmingly, the kind of conversations I was having with business people was just about that word confidence. And I get quite bored hearing about that because I'm kind of saying, you know, what does it really mean? What does it really mean? But up to a point, they were all saying the same thing, which is like, give us a vision, give us something to be excited about, give us something to be optimistic about. And the combination maybe of Reeves and Starmer from the very beginning has been like, it's dreadful, it's awful, we're not going to hide the truth, it's the unvarnished awfulness. And they're sick of that. You know, the people who should be creating the growth in this country don't want to hear that anymore.
I think that's so interesting, because I do think, and it's something we've talked about on the podcast a number of times, that frankly, this government has communicated very, very poorly in terms of setting a narrative of what it's trying to do.
Well, it's truthful, but it's just not optimistic.
Yes, but then they overdid the pessimism, and then they tried to overdo it in the other direction, and they haven't found a kind of that sure-footedness in the way that they've dealt with problems that have come up. But I also think there's a wider question, and maybe it's just impossible to govern at the moment. Maybe it is just that people's expectations of immediate results and that things will happen, and that, you know, we're trying to spend a whole episode not talking about Donald Trump today. I would just, you know, Donald Trump is
failed.
Yeah. Donald Trump is flooding the zone, as Steve Bannon would call it, with endless amounts of news that you don't have to follow up on.
He didn't call it endless amounts of news.
He called it shit. Yeah, okay, fine. So you're much cruder than I am, obviously. But, you know, what this government is doing is not flooding the zone. It's just kind of doesn't know what to do and what to say. Exactly. And I think that it's being filled by people who are trying to paint their own narratives of failure, and whether it's reform or whoever. And I just think it is really, really difficult to make headway in a social media age where there's incredible impatience, very limited attention span. And, you know, Rachel Reeves is saying, but I'm looking for the next 4 years.
But the question fundamentally is, if the growth is this bad, if the forecast for growth is this bad, then that spells tax rises or spending cuts, right? And that probably means spending.
I think this is the key point, right? And I think that, you know, obviously we get very interested in the personalities, and yeah, I mean, maybe, you know, you could swap Reeves out for someone who was more media friendly, had a better communication style, was able to kind of animate the animal spirits a bit more. Yeah, maybe you could do that. But fundamentally, the economic structures and the economic fundamentals would remain the same. Exactly. And what today means is that whilst the cut in interest rates will help a little bit on government borrowing, because it'll be a bit cheaper for the government to continue to borrow, and it's been really facing difficult, very high borrowing costs recently, it will mean that if inflation is at, you know, 3.5%, maybe tipping towards 4%, then in terms of two key things, it makes it harder for Rachel Reeves to stick to her spending plans and stick to her fiscal rules, in the sense that in order to keep public sector pay just at a level, just in real terms at the same level, you have to pay out more money. And just to keep departmental spending, keep it up with inflation, keeping it up to where it is in real terms, that costs more money. And if she's not going to borrow more and she's not going to tax more, then that means that probably you just can't do that, and we'll face even more severe cuts in non-protected government departments than we've seen. And the politics of that, both in the country but crucially within inside the Parliamentary Labour Party, could be absolutely tortuous.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.